Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in today's video what I want to do is do a DOM masterclass. I've done some intro to DOM videos before, but I figured now let's do something a little bit more thorough, a little bit longer, a little bit more concise. And first let's just talk about what is the DOM. The DOM stands for the Document Object Model. It really kind of relates to one of the sort of the most important things that JavaScript does, or really kind of the purpose of JavaScript when it was originally created, really to make websites interactive, to interact with the existing website. So to really kind of appreciate what the DOM is, we have to think about how does the browser read your HTML file. So to do that, let's create some files. Okay, so let's create actually let's just do this in terminal, save some time. So we'll use touch, which creates files, and we'll create an index.html, a app.js, and a styles.css. Okay, I will go here, I'll use Emmet to do the quick HTML boilerplate. Boop. Okay, and let's connect these two files. Again, let's connect the JavaScript file. Actually, we'll connect the CSS file first. I'll use Emmet again, so I'll start typing in link, and then choose link:CSS, and then just right here href. This refers to where the style sheet is. The style sheet is in the same folder, so // meaning it's in the folder that we're currently in, and it's actually called styles.css. Then we will create a file called, or link to the JavaScript file. So we type in script, do the script with the source property, and again same file // but app.js. Okay, so let's just first reacquaint ourselves with like HTML. Again, essentially we have this tag here, doc type. Okay, and the keyword here is document. Okay, it's telling us that what type of document to the browser, and the keyword that this is a document. So when we refer to the document object, it is a object that the browser is going to create based on your document. So think of your HTML file not necessarily as your website, but as the blueprint. Okay, you have to realize that your HTML file is a blueprint that gets read by the browser, which creates the actual website that the user experiences. Okay, and basically in JavaScript, in order for you to interact with that, these are JavaScript objects that you can interact with. Okay, and there's different objects. Okay, such as console.log, the window. Now the window object represents the actual browser window. So that exists before your HTML file is even read. So that's already available to us the minute, even before your website loads, so that we never have to worry about whether that exists. Then we have this object called the document. Now the document represents the HTML tag. Okay, so everything here, this is the document. So when we refer to the document object, it's basically an object created from this chunk of your code, from your HTML file. And basically everything below that gets lumped into this giant document object. Okay, we're going to console log these things so you can actually see them in the browser. And again, inside the document I can access pretty much your entire website. So for example, I can access your body. Okay, the document body. Okay, but watch, something kind of funny is going to happen with this console log. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this file with live server. And actually let's just put this to the side so that way we can kind of see our code next to our page. I'm going to open up DevTools so we can see the console. Now first let me just go to sources just to show you, like, see this app.js is connected. It is picking it up. Again, we can always just confirm these things by using the sources tab to confirm that we have these things available to us. And we can see that it read our document because we can actually see, like, this is technically, when you see this elements tab, what you're looking at is not your HTML file. You're actually looking at the object, the document object. So this is why this can actually be different than my HTML file. Okay, we'll come back to that. And then here's the console where all this JavaScript output. And you can see here's the window object, which represents the browser window. And that's always going to exist because your browser has to be open before the HTML file gets read. And that has all sorts of different properties. Let's just kind of take a quick look. So it has all these kind of functions built in, like alert. So And that's where a lot of the functions that you're actually using when you use JavaScript on the front end actually exist. Like alert exists because it's part of the window object. It's just you can call functions that are part of the window object without having to say window. So I could do window dot alert, and let's just say cheese, because that's what I do. Okay. It's complaining about it. Oh, because I put a capital. It's window dot alert. And see, it works. But I could also just call alert like so. Because the window is kind of assumed. Okay, Windows kind of assume when you're working in the browser because you're in the browser window. So absent, it'll always, window is essentially the prototype of everything that's kind of going on in the browser window. So if you're familiar with how prototypes work, if it doesn't find the thing that it's looking for, it always goes up the prototype chain. So everything is essentially a property of the window object. Okay, or basically if you don't put window and it can't find it, it'll check the window to see if there's something for that. But there's all sorts of cool stuff built into the window. Like fetch, if you've used fetch, that's in the window. All these things that we kind of just think is part of JavaScript are built into the window. Okay, think of the window as, again, the context in which your JavaScript is being executed. In the same way that if you run the code in Node, Node is the context that's being executed. Node is sort of your window, and you have like things like you have the process object in Node. Cool. But anytime you see the word on, that's an event. We'll come back to events, but there's a lot of different types of events. Okay, open database. So you see there's also really cool stuff the window can do. The window's just alone, we could probably spend hours on everything the window can do. Again, the document represents the HTML tag. Okay, so it starts here. Okay, so you can see like it also has lots and lots of stuff going on. Okay, it's never a bad idea to actually sit down and just kind of like read through this object once in a while, because it's a lot of cool stuff in it. And you can see here I do see the body. The body does exist, and I can go in the body, and I mean technically if there was children, I could go in here and like find the children and kind of work my way down the HTML file. Okay, and then each of these, well, we'll come back to that. But notice that when I did console log the body, I got null. To understand why this happened, we have to understand something about how the browser reads or indexes that HTML file. So let's think about it. Okay, the window already exists because the window exists just by the nature of my browser being open. So that's there. Now again, the document object is the HTML tag. Okay, so essentially that's the whole file. So that exists before my JavaScript is run. But the body tag doesn't exist till line 11, but my script tag is run on line 9. So that means my script is going to run before it even goes any further in the HTML file. So at the time that this JavaScript is run, okay, the body didn't exist yet. Okay, so there's a couple different ways we can fix this. Method number one is I could just paste my script tag at the bottom of my body. That was the old way, and once upon a time was the only way I could do it. And see, now I can console log the body, because the body gets created first, and then the script tag runs. But, you know, my issue with this is that typically you think of linking all your files in the head tag. So doing this is like now you have to look at two different places for where all your files are, how all your files are connected to your HTML file. It's just more organized to have it in your head. So if we want to keep it in our head, we can. I think that's clearer. But we then would have to change it in our JavaScript. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this alert because that's kind of annoying. Another way you could do it is you could take advantage of events. So again, that window object always exists, okay, before your HTML file is read, because it's the browser. So we can add an event to the browser. So the window, the document, and all the different nodes, which I haven't mentioned yet, they all have the ability to listen for events. So there's going to be, the browser's constantly going to be emitting, the word is emitting, certain events, like clicking on something, pushing down keys, things like that. And pretty much anything that's going on in the browser can listen for those events. So that just means if that event gets emitted in the vicinity of the event, of the thing, that thing can respond to it by running a function. Now the window is the entire vicinity. It's the entire thing. So technically, when it listens for an event, it can happen anywhere because it's the window and it's listening for events. So basically, we take anything we want to add an event to, and we say window.add event listener. And the event we want to listen for is load. That means the page has been done loading the document. So the document has been read entirely, and now we can proceed forward. So we can say, hey, instead of running while my JavaScript files run in the body, all the code is wrapped in this onload event, so it won't run until the DOM loads. And this would work too. See, right there's my body. So see, it still works. But this is, if you're not very familiar with add event listeners, this may just seem like an extra additional little bit of code to have to run. So what they've done is they've taken this whole onload event and turned it into a keyword. You can just literally add the word defer to your script tag. And what this does is it essentially runs that onload event. It just automatically assumes that, hey, you want all this file to not be read until the document has fully loaded. And once again, I can see my body. To me, that's my preferred solution. But just so that way you've seen all three. Okay, cool. So that's that story. Now let's put some HTML here. So let's say that we have a div. Inside that div, we have an h1 that says hello. And then below that, there's like a section tag. And in that section tag, there's a button that says click me. And so we see all this stuff visually on the screen like we normally would expect from HTML. But again, let's go, I see the body. And notice that before I could have seen the body in the document object, even before I fixed it. The reason is it's because when you console log the document, it's like a living object, and it'll change as things change. So even though I console log the document in the window before the body existed, that object is updating in the console. It has just had something to do with the way the browser console works with certain like DOM nodes. If they exist at the time, it'll update itself. Okay, but if I go into the document, again, I can go in the body here. It's just showing me the DOM type. Let me just see here if I can. Let's actually try to do it from the window. If I go to window, and then I look up the document in the window object. So here's the document, because again, the document is a property of the window. So the window, it always exists. The document gets created when it reads the HTML tag. And then in the HTML tag, there's the body tag. And then the body has several children. So there's a array called children. And see, that has the div tag. So if I go inside the div tag, and you notice that this is a script tag that's just injected by live server. Again, this is always going to represent what's going on in the browser, not what's in my HTML file. So live server injects some script tag to do some live server stuff. Okay, so I go inside the div, and then I take a look at the children of the div. And see, there's the h1 and the section. So let's go inside the section. And then I take a look at the children of the section. And then there's my button. So I could, I could do something like this. I could just say like console.log window.document.body.children 0, because it's going to be the first item in the array. And see, if I do that, I got the div. Okay, then if I say .children again, and I say the second item in the array, because that's the section, there's the section, and then I say the .children of that, because there's only the button in there, and see, I got the button. But you see, like, this is a long little line here, okay? So we can see here that everything kind of comes back down to the window object. There's the window object, the document object represents my HTML file generally has a body tag, and then it kind of just generates from there into all these array of children. So you could imagine like the DOM is like this big sort of like tree-like structure with sort of the window and the document at the top. Now this would be really annoying if you had to write all your code like this. So there's got to be better ways to travel throughout the tree. Another word for traveling through an object of data is called traversal. So I need to traverse this tree. Now, the document object is going to give you several different functions we can use to traverse the tree. So we'll examine them. But with that first, again, I just want to reiterate that, see, when you take a look here under elements, so see, if I open up the body, there's that script tag that, see, code injected by live server. What I'm seeing here in elements is not my HTML file. So see, I don't see that script tag in my HTML file. This is the DOM, okay? This is the living, breathing object that is currently being run by the browser. If I want to see the original HTML file, I could go to here to like sources, and here I can click on index.html and I can see the actual original source here. So if you ever want to compare what's going on in the DOM to the original source material, you can go to the sources. And the cool thing is I can edit the DOM. If I want to just temporarily like try something out, like try out a CSS property or something like that, I can just do it directly in here. So I can click on this H1, change this to cheese, and see, it changes it on the DOM. It changes it in the document, meaning in the browser, at this one browser window. But if I refresh the page, it's going to go through the whole process of reading the HTML file again and rebuild the document from scratch. So I'm back to hello. So I can edit stuff in here to like try things out, test things out. Same thing with like manipulating CSS. So I can go over here and I can like add a class to that H1. Class equals cheese. And then I can go over here in the CSS thing, I can add a style. So I can highlight the H1 and then click plus to add a style and say h1.cheese. So you see there, it shows the selector. Color blue. And see, I did it. I did the thing. But I'm not editing the actual HTML file. So this is really useful for being able to tell like what's kind of going on in the document, or to try things out before I put them in my HTML file or my CSS or my JavaScript file. But again, here you're doing sort of like live temporary edit. As soon as I refresh, all gone. Another thing that's nice about this is that when I click on a particular node, and again, each element is called a node. So body is sort of the mother node, and then below it there's like the div node, which then below that has the h1 node. They're referred to as DOM nodes. They're all nodes in a tree. So, but if I click on a particular DOM node, I can always see the list of different things that are styling it here. And it actually listed in the order that they're prioritized. So if you're wondering like why your styles aren't applying right, you can always find that particular element you're targeting, highlight it here, take a look at the list of things that are changing its styling to figure out like, hey, what's taking priority. So if maybe something else is over prioritizing the thing you're doing, and it's going to be very clear over here. On top of it, you can look at this box model where you can see like, okay, hey, here's the weight, the height and width of the thing, how much padding it has, how much border it has, how much margin it has, to get an idea of how much space it's taking. I can also use this tool right over here to select a particular DOM node and get some more details about it. Okay, very useful stuff. And of course, there's this button right here, so that way I can, you know, take a look at things in sort of like responsive mode. So I can see how like this would look on a phone or any screen, and I can actually choose from different preset phones right here. So that's all pretty useful. Okay, so now we know what the DOM is. Okay, now let's talk about different ways we can manipulate it that's built into our JavaScript. So I'm going to go back to our HTML, and I'm going to give this H1 a class. We'll just call it H1. We'll give it an ID of H1. And we'll give it an attribute of called H1 that equals H1. Okay? Is there such a thing as a property of H1? There's nothing built in to HTML that is called like an attribute. These are called attributes. Okay, an attribute is just basically anytime you have like a word equals something. Now there are certain built-in recognized attributes like classes for applying CSS, or for IDs for uniquely identifying objects or different nodes. But you can also just write your own made-up attributes. Okay, and what I'm going to try to show you now is that you can actually just kind of like grab different things in the DOM based on these factors. Okay, so there's some functions like the old school way of using JavaScript to grab elements is using all these get functions. And these get functions are kind of like long and verbose, and there's different ones for different situations, but let's show them to you. And then I'll show you like the newer, better way. Okay, so get element, but they're all, again, all these functions are methods of the document. So document get element by ID. So what I would do here is I would pass in an ID. So the ID was h1. And if I go to the console log, see, there's the h1. I'm console logging the h1 because it has an ID of h1. I could also do get element, and you can see the different ones here by class name. So I'm saying, okay, give me the one that has a class of h1. Now the difference here is that it doesn't give you, notice it says get elements by class name, because it is very possible that you might have more than one thing with the same class name. So what it does, it always is going to give you back an array. So I always have to remember to access the h1, I have to go to like, I have to use an index. So I have to be like, put like a 0 in square brackets after that. Then there's like get elements by name. So let's try, I think this would just be like, oh, this is there's a name attribute, which that works for like inputs. I mean, you could put a name attribute on anything if you really want. So that'd be like me putting sort of like name equals h1. So again, if I put, actually, let's just to confirm, let's just put h1s. I just want to confirm that it's grabbing it by the name attribute, h1s. Yep, and there it grabs the h1, okay, based on the name attribute. Then there's a get element by tag name, which is based on the HTML tag name. So this would be h1, and it'll grab me and give me an array of all the HTML tags that have h1 in their name. Those are fine, but memorizing all those functions can be a real pain. What happened is that eventually jQuery, which we will kind of touch upon later on, came around and really kind of made things simpler when it comes to doing all this like DOM code. And one of the things it did is that it said, how about you just choose which DOM elements you want based on their CSS selector? Eventually, JavaScript gets around and says, you know what, that's a good idea. Let's build in a function that does that. So they kind of built in that functionality through a function called query selector. So document.query selector. And generally, this is all you really need. And what you do here is you pass in a CSS selector. So if I pass in h1, it's going to give me the first h1 on the DOM. If I say dot h1, it's going to get me the first h1 with the class of, or the first thing with the class of h1 on the DOM. Okay. If I say hash h1, then it's going to give me the first thing with the ID of h1. It's just like your CSS. Okay. And if I do something like this, if I do, you know, square brackets h1 equals h1. Okay, and let me just put the other closing square bracket over here. And actually, the closing square bracket goes over here. Okay, if I do that, it's going to give me something that has an attribute that matches this, an attribute of h1 that equals h1. Okay, so however you would select it in your CSS, you can select it with query selector. Okay, so being good at CSS and CSS selectors translates in you being able to grab stuff in JavaScript. And again, any selector works. So I could do something like get me a body, a direct child, an h1 that's a direct child of the body tag. Okay, although I don't have one. That's right, because it's the div. Okay, so body direct child is a div, and the direct child that's an h1. Give me the first one that matches this. Okay, you could really get as complicated as you want. Generally, you don't need to, but you can. So let me grab that h1. Okay, so cool. So I can select any element I want that way, but that's always only going to get one, the first one that matches. If let's say there's multiple matches and I want to get all those multiple matches, okay, like for example, let's say I want to get all the children that are let's see here. Right now I don't really have multiple of anything. Let's put two h1s. hello and goodbye. So if I want to get all the H1s, then I would just say query selector H1, but except it wouldn't be query selector, it'd be query selector all. So see, now it gives me back an array, a node list. Not really, so it's not a true array. It's a special kind of array called a node list. And there's my two H1s. Cool. And I can manipulate them. So the first one, again, they're going to be in the order that they're in the DOM. So the first one is the one that says hello, and the second one that says goodbye, and I can manipulate them. So I can be like, okay, well, first let's save it in a variable. So const h1 list. Again, I'm just calling it that so that way you can tell what it is. H1 list document dot query selector all. Query selector all, and I want to get all the H1s. And if I say, hey, H1 list 0, so that's the first one, that should be the one that says good hello, there's two things I can change. I can change the inner text. Okay, the inner text property is the text that we see there, so I can change this to howdy. Okay, so see now it says howdy. I can then maybe change this for the second one, that's 0. I can actually put I can change the HTML that's between the opening and closing H1 tag. So that's the inner HTML. So it'll treat whatever this HTML here is as HTML. So we'll just say button that says this was an H1, or this is inside an H1. Okay. And then actually let me make that 1 because I want to change the 1 that says goodbye. There we go. So this is inside an H1. So I can edit that property. That property allows me to change like what the text of that particular thing is, or, the HTML inside that particular thing. That's pretty cool. Okay. This is particularly useful because you can inject a bunch of HTML on the page pretty easily. The thing you want to be careful for is you don't necessarily want the generation of this HTML to be generated based on like input that a user puts in a form, because they can try to inject things on your website, and sometimes like malicious things. And so what they'll do is they'll inject a script tag with like JavaScript that can do things. These are called like injection attacks, where they're trying to inject code, whether it's like trying to inject something into an SQL query, something inject a script, and essentially they're able to do sometimes malicious things by injecting code on your website because you give them a mechanism to add text to your website, or add text to an API call, because you're pulling it directly from a form. So generally, that's why you always hear that phrase, sanitize. Basically, you always want to, when you pull data from a form, you always want some level of validation to make sure that they're giving you what you wanted, not something malicious. Okay, cool. So that's fun. Okay, and speaking of forms, let's play with a form. Okay, so let's add like a form input. So I'll just add a single input. So we'll say input text equals, value type equals text. Okay, and I'll leave it at that. So here's the input. Okay, which, there we go, I can type in. So let's go grab that input. So input const input equals document dot query selector. And what I want is, just to be very clear, I want the input that has an attribute of type which equals text. I don't want other inputs, I just want that specific input. And I want to save it into this variable. Cool. So now what I can do is, let's make an event happen. Okay, so we can say input dot actually let's do it on that button. So let's do document, let's also just save the button in a variable, const button equals document dot query selector. okay, button. That's going to end up selecting this button because this button's technically going to be first up in the way that the DOM is set up. So like if I go here and I see which button pops up first in the DOM, it's going to end up being that button there because that's just the way it's going to read it. But let's add an event to that button. So let's say this button dot add event listener. Again, you can take that to any node, the window object, the document object, or any DOM node that you query. And I'm going to say what an event. I'm going to say when you click the button, I want something to happen. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to want a console.log the value of the input. So the input, every input has a value property, which is whatever you typed in the input or whatever the input's worth. So if I start typing in the input, oops, I don't want to type there, I want to type in the input. But if I click the button now, see it's console logging the input. So if you wanted to like do stuff with the input from a form, you would go grab all those inputs, query them in your DOM or in your JavaScript, and pull their values. Okay, so you can do that. Nice. Oh, and you can do all sorts of other cool stuff. I can manipulate the styling of the input. So I can do something like every node, so the H1s, the button, they all have a style object. And in the style object is very much like, it's basically an object with all your CSS properties. So think of every possible CSS property. Like if I console log this, let's take a look at how big it is. Console.log input.style. Oh, I have to click the button. There we go. And see, like there it is. So like every CSS property you can think of is in this object. So let's see, that's a huge object. But notice that, like, let's say we take a look at something like background color. Last I checked, when I see background color, when I write CSS, it's in kebab case, meaning there's a dash, so it's background dash color. But this is JavaScript. So in JavaScript, since it can't really support variable names with a dash in, like, or at least not easily, what it does, it changes all the names of all your CSS properties to camel case, so that way you can conform to JavaScript. This is also reason if you ever use React, you have to write all your inline CSS styles this way because you're technically writing JavaScript when you're writing your JSX in React, even though it looks like HTML. But I can change any of these things. So I can be like, hey, I want to change the background color. And let's make that blue. Okay, so now when I click the button, so see it, because again, this line here is inside the function that gets run when the event gets clicked. So if I do that, boo! Oh, blue is not defined. Oops, that's right, it's got to be a string. Not bad. There we go. Okay, and see, made it blue. So now this is blue, kind of hard to read, but that is what happens. And I don't know why I console logged it, but let's get rid of that console log. There we go. And while we're at it, we might as well change the font color to white. So input.style.color equals white. So that way it's readable. And see, like I changed the input. I could do that. I could literally create like changes in my styles directly in my JavaScript and just basically do it based on events. So user clicks this, the styling here changes, this thing appears, this thing. Usually this can be more used for like things like modals, where basically you click on a button and this modal appears and then you want the modal to disappear. So you're changing these styles based on things that are going on. Or like a carousel where you're clicking a button and the picture changes. Okay, these are the kind of things where you're going to be using JavaScript to kind of manipulate the styling, manipulate like a lot of these aspects of what's going on. Okay, so that's kind of where that comes into play. Now, speaking of images, let's talk about like changing an image. So let's put an image tag with no image. So here we have an image tag, and it has no image inside of it. Okay, so I don't see it right there. So let's grab a fun image. So let's go to images.google.com. Let's look up some cheese. So here's a block of cheese. I'm going to right click this right here, get the image address, and let's write some code. So let me grab that image. So I'll do document.query selector. And then we're going to grab the image tag. But instead of saving it in a variable, I'm just going to just do stuff right away. So I'm just going to say dot. What I want to do is set an attribute. Because again, the thing that tells an image tag what picture does it show is the source attribute, the src attribute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I want to set the source attribute on the image tag. And I would like to set it to this. Okay, so that's what it's going to change it to. So if I go back here, let's go back to elements. And if I take a look here in image, okay, if I take a look here in image, so you notice there's no source attribute. Now if I click the button, because again, this is all part of the function that runs when we trigger the button event. Okay, and see now the picture appears because see I added this source attribute. So you can see the source attribute got added to the image tag. So you can subtract attributes, you can remove attributes. So there's a function called remove attribute. You can get the current value of an attribute with get attribute. They all kind of work the same way. So you can generally manipulate anything, okay? Anything using the DOM API, meaning this whole like sort of language for talking to the document object, okay, that's built inside of JavaScript. But it's still a little verbose. So what happened is that, again, back in the day, and especially back in the day, there was a lot of different versions of this. So like there was Netscape Navigator, there was Internet Explorer, there was Chrome, there was Firefox, and each of them had like slight variations on like the JavaScript, how you do things in JavaScript. So it was very frustrating. You have to write your code in multiple ways. So eventually what happened was they came up with a thing called jQuery. And jQuery, so if I go to code.jquery.com, okay, jQuery basically, one, is going to give us a way of writing this code. It's a little bit more simpler, a little bit more straightforward, but also it's compatible across browsers. Like that was the big deal. Nowadays, browsers have kind of standardized, so like the benefit of using jQuery for browser standardization and compatibility is less than it used to be. A lot of the best ideas of jQuery got adapted into JavaScript, kind of like the document.query selector function. Was very much inspired by jQuery. So a lot of the times people are like, they boo-hoo jQuery nowadays because, you know, the reasons to use it aren't as pronounced as they once were. But there was a time, there's a reason why jQuery is like the most downloaded JavaScript library of all time. Because it solved such a big problem at the time. People still use jQuery, and there's a lot of old websites that still use jQuery a lot. So if you get hired by a company that has an older website that's been around for a little bit longer, there's a good chance that you have to deal with some jQuery code. But it's still useful, okay? There's going to be certain projects where, you know, if you don't want to use just like this raw DOM API that we've been using so far, where jQuery might be the alternative, because you're building something simple, you're not necessarily building a full-on application, in which case, you know, something like a React, Angular, Vue, a Svelte, Solid.js may make more sense. Because there's just a lot of data, and the data affects what's going on the UI a lot more, so there's a lot more changes going on. But jQuery is a pretty good solution. So let's see here. Let's go. So once you go to code.jquery.com, all I have to do is copy the script tag. So I click on that, and it's going to give me the script tags that I can then copy to my HTML file. So I'll copy that, and I can just inject. Now, of course, you would want this above your script tag, because you want jQuery to be loaded before your JavaScript runs. But yeah, now I have jQuery available, and just so you can kind of see how this changes, we'll keep the same code. The code won't change. We're just going to translate it into jQuery, so you can see sort of how jQuery condenses things. So document.querySelector.all, well, in this case, everything in jQuery gets replaced with this $sign function. So if I did this, $sign, okay, now I've queried all the H1s. And just so you can see what happens, console.log, I'll console log H1 list. We'll go to the console and see, but notice it's not a DOM nodes array. Before you had like this array called like a node list. See, instead you get this jQuery object. So the way jQuery works is that everything revolves around creating jQuery objects. So when I query something, everything is this jQuery object that's technically kind of like an array of things, but it could be an array of one thing. And it has all these functions for manipulating things in that array. And the beauty of that is, and then all those functions return the object back. So the beauty of that is I can then chain a lot of these functions together. So I can be like, do this, do that, do this. So for example here, where I change the text to howdy, how would this look like? It would say h1.list text, and then I would use this function. So instead of saying I'm setting the property, I want to use this function that'll set the property for me. Okay, and then this should be h1. And now, so you notice how this didn't work with the 0. The reason is because this array is technically still an array of nodes. So if I look at this, see, it's still the DOM node. It's still the DOM node. It's not a jQuery object. So to turn that thing into a jQuery object, to access like the first item in the array, you have to use this function called eq0 that just grabs one element. Eq grabs an element from the jQuery array and just returns it as a jQuery object. So see, now it works. But notice how I can chain all these things. So like, hey, I changed the text, and now I could actually go change a style. So I could be like style, actually it would be a .css, and I'll say, hey, let me change the color to blue. And see, now it's blue, and I can do this all on one line. That is really cool. Okay, that's kind of like the beauty of jQuery. So now if I keep just, updating this, so like this would be, of course, .eq1, because we're accessing the second item in the jQuery array. And then, except we're changing the HTML, and again, everything in jQuery is a function instead of like just changing properties directly. So it would look like that. Same, again, I'm ended up making the same thing. And again, anytime I use document.querySelector, I could just replace it with a $sign. So right there, I'm cutting out big chunks of my code. That's a lot less typing. Okay, and this just does the same thing, gives you back to you as a jQuery object. And then for the button, instead of using add event listener, the function is just called on. Okay. And you see, like, this kind of reduces a lot of characters that you would have to type. And then here, like, to get the value from the input, I would just type in input.val. Okay, and let's see if I click here. Well, there's nothing typed in the box yet. And then the change to CSS, it would be this instead. So it would be like input.css, background color, blue. Okay, and then this would be input.css, color white. Okay, and again, the query selector here would change into a $sign. And then set attribute would actually be called set adder. Okay, or actually it wouldn't even be a set adder, it would just be adder, like that. So you can see it condenses everything quite a bit. That's the beauty of jQuery. So now if I click the button, it does the same thing as it did before, but you see everything's just like a lot more condensed. That's kind of what's nice about it. And then I can chain things like this. That's pretty cool. Okay, a couple other things, like what if I want to make new things? So let's say I wanted to create like a new h1, or let's say a new h2, and I attach it to the DOM. Let's see how I would do that. First, we'll do it in plain vanilla. Plain vanilla just means normal JavaScript. Okay, cool. Plain vanilla. First, I would create the new node. So we'll say create a new h2. So first, I'm going to create a variable for it, and we'll say this h2, and then I'm going to use document.create element that creates the new element h1. Then I would change the text of the element. So h2.inner text. We'll say this is a plain vanilla h2. It was created with plain vanilla JS. And then I actually have to attach it to the DOM. So we'll say something like document.querySelector. Okay, and and actually this is inner text is not a function. That's a property. Again, when we're using plain vanilla, you're setting properties of the node. Document.query selector. Let's grab the div tag that's in the DOM. And const div equals document.query selector. And then I'm going to say, hey, to the div, I want to append the h2. Okay, and see, there it is. That's how you create a new element. I create the element, because if I create the element, it doesn't mean it's in the node tree, so it's not going to be visible. I have to plop it somewhere in that tree by appending it to as a child to some element. So that's how I would do that in plain vanilla JS. In jQuery, okay, because I can chain things, I can make it much more succinct. Okay, so I can do this. I can say $div, so I'm going to select the div, and I say, hey, you know what? I want to attach something to the div. So the div.append, and what I want to append to the div, I use the $sign again because that's the jQuery function, and then I use h2, and this means a new h2. Okay, but that h2, I'd like to change the text to this is made in jQuery. And see, I attached that h2 to there. Okay, and see that does the same thing that this does. We see how like more condensed that is. I can just say, hey, to the div, I appended this h2 with the text of this made in jQuery. So that's kind of like what makes jQuery very cool, like that ability to like really sort of condense your logic, not having to type in like document.this, document.that every time. You can just pretty much plop a $sign, and that $sign, depending on how you use it, like what you pass to it, does different things, and that's like really cool. But I think you guys got the idea. So we've learned about like how to manipulate our elements. We've learned about how to create elements and append them to the DOM. We've learned how to do this in a little bit about how to do this in jQuery and just normal JavaScript. It's a lot of fun. One more thing to know that you can do is you can create your own HTML tags. So let me just get rid of all of this. Okay, I can create my own HTML tags, and that's using something called web components. Now, usually what I would do, so if I were to keep all that, what I would normally do is I would want to keep my web component code in a separate file. So I would create a file called components.js. Okay, because I generally want all my components to be registered before any JavaScript runs. So I would then just attach that, make another script tag. Script source components.js. And here it doesn't really matter that you use the defer keyword or not, because nothing in that file should be running. Like all you're doing is you're creating some definitions of new HTML tags. You're not actually rendering anything to the DOM or referring to anything that will be on the DOM yet. Okay. So that's fine. And basically what you do is you create a class. So let's say we want to create just like a pretty button component. Okay, and this is, and if you've used like React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, Solid, you're familiar with like components and the idea of components. But the cool thing about web components or native web components is that they're built in the JavaScript now. So you don't have to necessarily always bring in React if you do want a component, or bring in Vue or Angular if you want components. If you just need like a single component that you want to use between multiple projects, you can just put it in a file and then just attach that file. So for example, I would create a class. We'll say class, we'll call it pretty button. And these classes always need to extend HTML element, which represents sort of like one HTML tag. So basically I'm saying, hey, I'm creating a new HTML tag based on the core HTML class. Then it needs to have a constructor, because all classes that need to have a constructor, especially if you're doing inheritance, and that inheriting constructor needs to run the parent constructor using super. So that's like that's what you have to do. Like that's like the minimum. Okay. Now here's the thing. I want to control this new HTML tag internally. I don't really want things outside of this HTML tag to affect it. So that means I don't want like if I'm going to use this across multiple projects, so I don't necessarily want CSS applying to this that's not built into this particular button. So this button's going to have its own kind of styling mechanism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it what's called a shadow DOM. The shadow DOM means any CSS from the outside cannot go in, and any CSS inside doesn't go outside. So it creates like a little wall around the HTML tag. So I would say this, because again, this represents the thing I'm creating. This dot attach shadow, that is going to attach the shadow DOM. And then we just say mode. Actually, you have to pass it in an object. That object has to have a property called mode, and it's always going to be open. You would never want to close that. It just means, can you see the element in, like the shadow DOM in DevTools, which you generally always want to see. Okay, so this dot attach shadow. So now it has a shadow DOM. So going forward, instead of using like document dot this, document dot that to refer to this particular element, it's going to be this dot shadow root. Okay, and then shadow root is going to work just like the document does, where I can use like query selector all, except instead of querying the entire documents node tree, this particular HTML element is going to have its own unique node tree. So you could literally create a whole like little mini website here that you can just inject via like an HTML tag. We're not going to make it that complicated, but here's what we can do. So we'll say this dot shadow root dot inner HTML, and it's just going to equal a button. Okay. Cool. Okay, the button, and what we will do is we want any text that you type in this particular tag to show up in between the button. Okay, so we're going to put what's called a slot. Okay, and what that does is that anything you put between the opening and closing tag will show up in this slot. Okay, so we'll start with just that. So essentially all we really did was recreate a button tag so far. Okay, so to register this, you have to do document. Actually, you don't even need to do that. You just do custom elements registry, or custom elements dot define. And what this does is you're telling the browser that, hey, I'm creating a new HTML tag, and the name of it has to be 2 words. So it always has to be pretty, or I mean a word dash a word, kebab case. So pretty button is the HTML tag. So it's got to be always kebab case and lowercase. So pretty button. And whenever I use this pretty button HTML tag, I want you to create it based on the pretty button class. So essentially when I use pretty button, it's just going to run this constructor function, which means it's going to just do whatever that does. It's going to create a shadow DOM, and then in that shadow DOM put this button. That's what it does. So for example, and the cool thing about it is that once you create the tag, you can use it over and over again. So I can be here like pretty button, and I can use it like several times. And inside pretty button, I'll put cheese. And see, like that, and put the words in there, because again, anything in between, anything that's in between the opening and closing tag gets injected where that slot is. That's what the slot does. Okay, so it's allowing me to type that text in there. If I were to get rid of that, then the text would not register. Well, okay, so for now, I've just recreated a glorified button. Okay, but I can have some more fun with this. Cool. Now what I can do is, let's say we want to let you specify, like customize this button. So first we'll do certain styling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually have some style in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use these double quotes. Problem with that is then I can't have multiple lines. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use backticks, because backticks allow you to write multiple lines of text. So I'm also going to inject a script tag. I mean, not script tag, a style tag, so I can style the button. Okay, and I'm going to say I want the button. Okay, the button. And the cool thing about this is I don't have to like worry about like classes, IDs, or anything like that, because this style tag, since it's in the shadow root, will only affect the stuff in the shadow DOM. So only for that particular HTML element. It won't affect other ones. It's unique to itself. So button, and so we'll say that I want the button to have a padding of 10 pixels, and then background color. And now since I'm using backticks, I can do string interpolation, meaning I can inject string stuff into the string. So I'll do that. I'm going to say get attribute. We're going to say, hey, we're going to do this dot get attribute, and we're gonna expect that you put in a BG attribute on the element. Okay. And then we'll put a color attribute, and we'll do sort of the same thing. This dot get attribute. So this is like getting props. So if you've used like React or Vue, this is gonna be similar to getting props. Okay, color. Okay, and then that'll be that. So see, the buttons already have 10 pixels of padding. Let's just make that font a little bit bigger. Font size, we'll say 1.3 EMs. So you see they're all bigger. But now I can go to each individual one. Each one has a life of its own. So I can be like BG equals green. Okay, that didn't quite work the way I wanted that to work, but we'll address that in a second. Color equals yellow. Okay, so supposedly had that worked out the way I wanted to, green would have been injected here, and this would have been injected there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do this. We're going to console log this .get attribute just to double check, hey, am I thinking about this right? So console.log and null null null. So let's see here, dot attribute in the HTML file BG equals green. It's not picking up on the attributes. What am I missing here? Do I need to do this dot shadow root? I don't think so, but let's try it out. Yes, what I thought. Okay, this dot get attribute. Oh, I think I know why. Maybe in this case we do want to use. No, I don't think we need to use defer, but let's just double check. I will put the defer keyword, see if that still matters. Yep, nope, that did. That made the difference. So you still want to use the defer keyword. Okay, cool. But yeah, see there, now this button has green and yellow, and then I could do the same thing for the other ones. And so now each button can be unique, but like I don't have to redo the padding and the font size each time. So I can create a customizable button that has like a lot of the styling that I already need. So I can just make this one blue and this one red. So I can create like an HTML tag that I can customize, but you know, again, I save myself a lot of the work of having to do styles that I've already done or build functionality. Again, this class can get as complicated as you want. So you can build all sorts of functionality, all sorts of really fancy things. But the point is, that's another thing you can do. You can create your own custom HTML tags. I have some videos where I go a lot more in depth about this because there's just a lot going on with the web component API. So look up my web components masterclass video. But at this point, we're about hitting an hour in this DOM masterclass video. So I think at this point, you have a pretty good idea of how the DOM API works. And so I do recommend that you explore further and play around with this and experiment with this, because a lot you can do with this. There's a lot of different like techniques to learn. But a lot of them you just kind of stumble across as you kind of try to solve different problems. But play with it. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.